It is barely light and the little thing is already working. Picture it. A small, square, open-topped runabout, no roof, no doors worth the name, mud up to the axles, bouncing down a rutted track that no sane person would call a road. It has just carried a colonel to the front and dropped him in the dirt. On the way back it will carry 2 stretchers lashed across the back, and a wounded man will make it to a surgeon because of it. By lunchtime it will have towed a field gun out of a bog, run a spool of telephone wire across 3 fields, and stood with its engine idling and its back wheels jacked up, driving a belt that powers a saw or a pump, or a generator charging a radio that will call in the next move of the whole war. It is not a tank. It weighs a fraction of a tank. You could very nearly pick one end of it up if you got a few friends round it. And yet when the great men sat down after it was all over and made their lists of the machines that actually won the Second World War, this daft little quarter-ton buckboard was on nearly every one of them. Sitting there in the mud, next to the tanks and the bombers, cool as you like, and I want you to look at that funny little vehicle bouncing across the field, because I am going to spend the next while telling you something that sounds mad until you've had your hands inside these things. That the war was not won by the glamorous stuff. It was won by this. By the humble, the reliable, the boring. By the machine that just turned up every single morning and did the work. Let me get the oil off my hands and say hello. I'm Reg. For the best part of 40 years I made my living keeping old military vehicles alive. A fitter, a mechanic, a restorer, whatever word you fancy. Tanks, trucks, gun tractors, the lot. If it had been shot at some time before I was born and it wouldn't start, it ended up in my workshop, leaking onto my floor and ruining my weekend. And I'll be honest with you about something because it's the whole reason I make these. When I was a younger man, I only had eyes for the big beasts, the tanks, the fighters, the thundering, frightening, magnificent machines that get the films made about them. I'd have walked straight past the vehicle I'm about to introduce you to without a second glance. More fool me, because I've since spent enough of my life with a spanner in my fist to know a hard truth that the films never tell you. Wars aren't won by the frightening machines. They're won by the ones that work. And of all the machines I've ever laid a hand on, none of them worked quite like this one. So budge up. Let me tell you about the Jeep. Now, we all half know the Jeep, don't we? It's one of those shapes that's soaked into the world. Flat bonnet, round headlamps, a grille with those upright slots, open to the weather, tough as an old boot. It's in every war film, usually with somebody important sat in the back looking stern. It became a civilian thing after the war, went on to father whole families of off-roaders, gave its name to an entire kind of vehicle, so familiar you stop seeing it. But stop and actually think about the claim I just made, because it's a strange one. Here is a vehicle with no armor to speak of, no big gun, nothing about it that would frighten anybody. A thing so small and so simple that, next to a tank, it looks like a toy somebody left in the yard. And yet the most senior men of the whole war, the ones who saw everything, who had every wonder weapon and every heavy tank at their disposal, those men kept naming this little runabout as one of the tools that actually got the job done. How? How does the smallest, humblest, least warlike thing on the whole battlefield end up rated alongside the machines that cost 100 times as much and weighed 50 times more? That's the question. And to answer it, I have to take you back to a factory floor and a deadline that should have been impossible. The story starts in 1940, and it starts with the American Army realizing, a bit late, that it had a gap. Armies had always run on horses and on men's legs and on whatever trucks they could muster. But a modern army moving fast needed something new, A small, light, tough, go-anywhere vehicle. Four-wheel drive, so it could claw its way across ground that stopped an ordinary car dead. Light enough to be manhandled out of a ditch by its own crew. Simple enough to be built in numbers nobody had ever contemplated. A runabout for scouting, for carrying messages, for hauling a light gun, for a dozen jobs they hadn't even thought of yet. Not a war winner, just a workhorse, a pair of boots on wheels. So the army wrote out what it wanted and sent it round to the motor firms, and the deadline it attached was, frankly, insulting. They wanted a working prototype in a matter of weeks, not months, weeks. A running, driving, brand-new vehicle to a brand-new specification, in less time than it takes most firms to agree on the color of the paint. Most of the big manufacturers took one look at that timescale and walked away. Couldn't be done, they said. And they had a point. It shouldn't have been possible. But a small outfit called American Bantam, a little firm that built little cars, and that was, if we're honest, hungry for the work in a way the big boys weren't. American Bantam said yes. And they did the thing that could not be done. Working flat out, leaning hard on the sharp mind of a freelance engineer they brought in, they designed and built a running prototype in a matter of weeks and drove it to the Army's test ground. They called it the Blitz Buggy. Later, fondly, Old Number 1. And it worked. This scrappy little machine, thrown together against an impossible clock by an outfit nobody had heard of, went out onto the test course and proved that the mad idea was real. That you really could have a tiny, tough, four-wheel drive go-anywhere vehicle. And every Jeep that ever followed, every single one of the hundreds of thousands, traces back to that first desperate sprint. I love that. I properly love that, because it's so often the way, isn't it? The big clever firms say it can't be done, and the little hungry one, with nothing to lose, just quietly goes and does it. Now here's where the story turns, and here's where you learn the first great lesson of this whole war, so pay attention because it comes back again and again. Bantam built the first one. Bantam proved it could be done. And Bantam was, in the end, too small to build the numbers the Army was going to need. Because the Army didn't want one Jeep, or 100, or 1,000. The Army, once it saw what this little thing could do, was going to want them by the hundreds of thousands. And a tiny firm, however clever, simply could not pour out machines on that scale. So the Army did the ruthless, sensible thing. It took the idea and it brought in the big players who could actually mass produce. Two firms ended up building the Jeep for the war. One was Willys Overland, and Willys brought something precious to the table, an engine. A stout little four-cylinder flathead they called the Go Devil. And what a name! And what an engine, not powerful by the numbers on paper, but gutsy, torquey down low where a working vehicle needs it, and above all tough. It would pull and keep pulling and not complain. The soldiers loved it. A mechanic loves it too, because a simple, stout, low-stressed engine is an engine you can keep alive with a rag and a prayer in the middle of nowhere. That Go Devil engine is a big part of why the Willys design became the standard. And the other firm was Ford. And Ford brought the one thing that decides wars, which is the sheer genius for making things in colossal numbers. Ford knew how to turn a design into a river of identical vehicles flowing off a production line. So the two of them built it. The standardized wartime Jeep became the Willys MB, and Ford built its own version of that very same design under license, and called it the GPW, the W as it happens, standing for Willys, because it was Willys' design Ford was building. Same vehicle, two factories, and between them, and it still takes my breath away, they built somewhere around 640,000 Jeeps during the war. Something like 360,000 from Willys, near enough 280,000 from Ford, 640,000. Say it slowly. That is not a weapon. That is a flood. And I want to stop on that number because the number is not a boring statistic. The number is the entire point. It is the whole reason we're here. Anybody can build one brilliant machine. A workshop of clever men, given time and money and no deadline, will build you a marvel. The Germans, bless them, were the masters of it, beautiful, intricate, overthought machines that make your jaw drop. What almost nobody can do is build the good enough machine 640,000 times over, to a standard pattern, with interchangeable parts, so that a Jeep knocked out in the desert and a Jeep knocked out on a Pacific island and a Jeep back home in a training depot are, to a man with a spanner, the very same Jeep. The same bolts, the same parts in the same crates, the same manual. That is not a lesser kind of engineering than the beautiful one-off. It is a harder kind and a rarer kind. And this is the thing the tank worshippers never want to hear. It is the kind that actually wins. Because a war is not one glorious duel. A war is a million small jobs done every day, everywhere at once for years. And to do a million small jobs, you do not need one wonderful machine. You need a flood of reliable, ordinary, fixable ones. The Jeep was the flood. Right. Let me tell you what they actually did with them, because this is my favorite part, and it's the part that turns a clever little runabout into something close to a miracle. The Jeep's real genius wasn't any one job. It was that it would turn its hand to absolutely anything. It was a scout, light and quick and quiet enough to nip forward, have a look at what was over the next hill, and nip back, the eyes of an army. It was a staff car. That's the one everyone pictures. The general in the back, mud on his boots, going up to see the front for himself because the Jeep could actually get him there. It was an ambulance, fit a frame across the back, and it carried stretchers. And a great many men owe their lives to the fact that a Jeep could reach a place a proper ambulance never could, and bounce a wounded man back to a surgeon over ground that had no road left on it at all. It was a little truck, pilot with ammunition boxes, ration crates, spare parts, wounded, whatever needed to get from here to there, and off it went. And then it got clever. Jack up the back wheels, and that gutsy engine, still turning, could drive a belt, and now your Jeep is a power source. It'll run a saw. It'll run a pump. It'll spin a generator to charge the batteries for the radios, which is to say it kept the nervous system of the army alive. They used them to lay telephone wire, a great spool spinning off the back as the Jeep crawled along, stitching a line of communication across the countryside as it went. They mounted a machine gun on some of them, and I'll leave the gun itself well alone, because it's the vehicle I care about. The point for us is simply that this humble runabout was steady and tough enough to serve as a moving mount, another job on the pile. And here is the one that gets me every time, the one I still can't quite believe when I see the photographs. They put flanged wheels on them and ran them on railway tracks, on the actual railways. A little road car, converted in an afternoon, chuffing along the rails, hauling loads where the locomotives had been knocked out. Scout, ambulance, truck, staff car, gun platform, generator, wire layer, railway engine. One machine. And when one Jeep wasn't load enough, you hitched a little trailer to the back of it and doubled what it could haul, a scrap of nothing on wheels. And now your runabout is a supply column. That was the spirit of the thing all over. Whatever the job was, somebody looked at the Jeep and thought, well, it'll probably do that too. And it usually did. But the deepest bit of its genius isn't on any of those lists of jobs. It's where it could go. The big trucks were grand on a decent road and hopeless off one. The moment the ground turned to mud or sand or a hillside or a shell-cratered ruin of a field, the heavy stuff bogged down and stopped. And that's exactly where the Jeep came into its own, light enough that if it did stick, 4 men could lift the back end and swing it round by hand. 4-wheel drive to claw up a bank a car would slide back down, small enough to thread between the wreckage. It went the last mile, the awful, roadless, shot-to-pieces last mile that decides whether the message arrives, whether the wounded man reaches the surgeon, whether the ammunition gets to the men who are out of it. The grand machines got you clothes. The Jeep got you there. You see, a tank can do one thing magnificently and terrifyingly. The Jeep could do everything modestly and reliably, and it could do it in the places nothing else could reach. And an army, it turns out, needs the second thing far, far more often than it needs the first. Now, I can't get through a whole story about this machine without stopping on the one question everybody actually asks, which is, why on earth is it called a Jeep? And I have to be dead straight with you here, because accuracy is the whole reason I bother doing this. And the honest answer is nobody knows for certain. It's disputed. Genuinely, properly disputed, and anyone who tells you they know for a fact is selling you something. But it's a lovely little argument, so let me lay out both sides and let you make up your own mind. The first idea, the neat and tidy one, is that it comes from letters. The military does love to label a vehicle with a code, and there's a school of thought that a designation on these things, a G and a P, got run together by the soldiers into a sound, GP, Jeep. And you'll hear people say the P stood for general purpose, which fits so beautifully you want it to be true. Trouble is, the tidy version might be a bit too tidy. Because dig into what those letters were actually doing on the paperwork, and it gets murkier. There's a strong case that the letters were a manufacturer's code and a wheelbase class, not a poetic little phrase meaning does anything. So general purpose may be a lovely story stapled on afterwards to explain a nickname that already existed. Flag that one. I can't prove it either way, and neither can anyone else. And then there's the other idea, and it's the one I secretly hope is true because it's got more joy in it. There was a comic strip before the war, the one with Popeye the sailor in it. And in it there was a little creature, Eugene the Jeep. And this Eugene was a magical sort of animal that could go anywhere, get through anything, solve any problem, pop up where you least expected. Go anywhere. Do anything. Sound like a machine you've just met. The word Jeep was floating around in the culture from that little comic creature before this vehicle ever turned a wheel. And the theory goes that soldiers, seeing this daft little thing that could go anywhere and do anything, reached for the name that already meant exactly that. So which is it? The letters, run together on a soldier's tongue, or the magic comic creature that could go anywhere? I'm not going to pretend to you that I know, because I don't, and the truth is the experts don't agree either. Both stories have been argued hard by people who have spent years on it. I'll just do what I always do, put both cards on the table, face up, and tell you honestly it's an open question. But I'll confess my heart's with the little comic creature. A machine that could go anywhere, named after a creature that could go anywhere. It's too good. I want it to be true. Wanting a thing to be true, mind, is exactly how myths get made, so don't take my heart for evidence. Take it as a question we may simply never close. There's one more famous thing I have to hand you, and I have to hand it to you carefully, wrapped in a caveat, because it gets quoted badly all the time. It's about that list I mentioned right at the start, the machines that won the war. General Eisenhower, the man who commanded the whole Allied effort in the West, is very widely reported to have named the Jeep as one of a small handful of tools that mattered most to victory. And that's a genuinely striking thing for a supreme commander to say, that a tiny, unarmored runabout belonged in the same breath as the great war machines. It's quoted everywhere, and there's a solid basis for it. But here's where I have to be a careful mechanic with the facts, because the exact wording and the exact companions on that list wander about depending on who's telling it. In his own written account of the war, he set the Jeep alongside things like the humble bulldozer, the 2.5-ton truck, the famous Deuce and a Half, and the C-47 transport plane, the Dakota. In other, looser retellings, you'll hear the Jeep paired with the Dakota again, and the landing craft and the bazooka and this and that. The lists don't quite match each other. So I'm not going to stand here and read you one perfect sentence as if it were carved in stone, because the honest picture is a bit blurrier than that. What's solid, what you can hang your hat on, is the shape of it. A man who had every fearsome weapon of the age at his command looked back and put this little quarter-ton workhorse among the things that truly mattered. And look at the company it keeps on every version of that list. A bulldozer, a truck, a transport plane, a landing craft. Notice something. Not one of them is a glamorous killing machine. Every single one of them is a workhorse, a mover, a builder, a carrier. The Supreme Commander's list of war winners is a list of humble, reliable, unglamorous machines that got things from one place to another and got the ground ready. And sitting right in the middle of that unglamorous, war-winning company, the Jeep. That right there is the whole secret of this war, hiding in plain sight in a quote everybody misremembers. So let me say the thing plainly now, the thing this whole story has been driving at, because it took me most of my working life to really believe it, and it's the opposite of everything the films taught me as a boy. The Second World War was not won by the best tanks. It was not won by the most beautiful fighters or the most terrifying guns. It was won by logistics, by supply, by the deeply unsexy business of making enormous quantities of reliable equipment and getting it with its fuel and its spare parts and its food and its ammunition across oceans and continents to exactly where it was needed, and then keeping it running once it got there. That is the war. That grubby, patient, endless organizing is the war. The battles are the bit you see. The supply is the bit that decides who wins them. There's an old soldier's saying that the amateurs talk about tactics and the professionals talk about supply, and every year I spent with these machines drove it deeper into me. You can have the finest tank ever forged, and if it's out of fuel, it is a very expensive rock. You can have the cleverest gun in the world, and with no shells for it, it's a length of pipe. The side that wins is not usually the side with the best single machine. It's the side that can put good enough machines everywhere they are needed, keep them fed and fueled and running, and replace them faster than the enemy can knock them out. And the Jeep is the perfect little symbol of the whole idea, because the Jeep is logistics with a steering wheel. Its entire life was moving. Moving men, moving messages, moving the wounded, moving supplies, moving power itself down a spinning belt. It never won a glorious duel because it was never in one. It was too busy doing the 10,000 small, vital, invisible jobs that let the glorious machines function at all. The tank got the photograph. The Jeep got the tank its fuel, carried the message that told it where to go, laid the wire that let it be commanded, and carried its commander up to see the ground. Take the tanks away and the war goes on, slower and harder. Take away the Jeeps and the trucks and the ships and the endless boring supply, and the tanks are just ornaments sitting in a field, out of fuel, out of parts, out of the war. That's the turn. That's the thing I most want you to walk away with. We remember the war as a story of its most frightening machines. It was really a story of its most reliable ones. Let me bring that down to my own greasy little corner of it, because I don't want this to float off into a lecture. I've had Jeeps in the workshop over the years, and I'll tell you what working on one does to you. It humbles you in the best way. My old partner Stan, and if you've watched me before you'll know Stan and I have never agreed on a single thing in 40 years. Stan always turns his nose up at them. Too simple, he says. Nothing to it. No romance. He wants to be elbow deep in something complicated and temperamental, does Stan, preferably something that'll fight him, because then he can feel clever when he wins. And that right there is the whole trap of the human heart in one miserable old man. Because I've watched Stan spend 3 months coaxing some rare, precious, over-engineered lump back to life, swearing at it, ordering parts that don't exist, filing things to fit, while this old girl of a Jeep sits in the corner that I had running in an afternoon with a set of ordinary spanners and a clean look at a manual any fool could follow. There's no mystery to a Jeep. Everything's there to be reached. Everything comes apart and goes back together the way your hands expect. It was built by people who assumed, correctly, that it would be fixed by tired, ordinary men in bad conditions with the wrong tools, and so they made it as forgiving as a machine can be. Stan calls that boring. I call it the highest form of engineering there is. It's a lot harder to make a thing simple and reliable than to make it complicated and clever. Now, I'll not pretend they were all angels. I once had one that would not idle to save its life, sulked worse than Bessie, that old tank of mine that famously refused to start for 3 months and cost me my temper and half my vocabulary. But the Jeep came round in an afternoon of honest fiddling, not a season of despair. And when it caught and settled into that gutsy little flathead beat, it sounded like a machine that just wanted to get back to work, which is exactly what it was. And I can never talk about a machine that got built in the hundreds of thousands without stopping on the people who built it, because they are the ones the films forget. 640,000 Jeeps didn't fall from the sky. Every one of them was somebody's shift, men too old for the fighting and lads too young, and women in their hundreds of thousands who'd never held a tool in their lives, stepping onto a production line and learning to build a war machine so a soldier they'd never meet, on the far side of the world, would have something under him that started in the cold and got him home. Somebody torqued every bolt on that Jeep in the cold open. Somebody's hands. That, to me, is the real war effort, not just the men at the front, but the vast, patient army behind them making the reliable, ordinary things 640,000 times over. My granddad had a Jeep out there. Drove one, kept one going, depended on one. And he almost never talked about the frightening parts of the war, but he'd talk about that Jeep. Fondly. The way you talk about an old dog that never once let you down. He said it always started. He said it went places it had no business going. He said that in a world where everything was breaking and burning and failing, the little Jeep just kept working, and there was a comfort in that you couldn't put a price on. It took me most of my life to understand that when my granddad called that machine reliable, it was the highest thing he knew how to say about anything. And here's where I turn it round on you, because I didn't drag you through the whole life of one little runabout just to win a pub argument about the Second World War. I think about the Jeep and the tank a lot out in the workshop, and after a while I stop thinking about machines at all and I start thinking about us. About the way we're built deep down to worship the wrong thing. We fall for the hero, the flashy one, the frightening, magnificent, expensive one that gets the film made about it, We always have. We drool over the fastest car, the biggest number, the most impressive thing in the room. And meanwhile, the whole of our actual lives is quietly held up by the humble, reliable, unglamorous things that just show up and work. The old car that always starts. The friend who always answers. The dull, dependable routine that carries you through the bad years without ever once asking for the credit. Nobody makes a film about the reliable one. Nobody puts the workhorse on the poster. We save our admiration for the tank and hand the medal to the glamour. And then, if we're honest, we go home to a life that was won every single day by the Jeep, by the boring thing that turned up. That's the bit I'd ask you to sit with. Not how clever these old machines were, how much of what matters in a war and in a life gets done by the humble thing nobody's watching. The war was won by the machine that started on a cold morning and did the work. And so, mostly, are we. So that's my question for you, and I do read the comments, so tell me straight. What's the Jeep in your life? What's the plain, humble, reliable thing, a car, a tool, a habit, a person, that never gets the glory, never gets the film made about it, but that has quietly carried you further than all the flashy stuff put together? Be honest with yourself, and then tell me about it below. I genuinely want to know. I'm off to go and rub Stan's nose in the fact that my Jeep's been running for a week, and his precious, complicated darling still won't idle. And if you liked having a look at the little machine instead of the frightening one for a change, then subscribe and stick around, because I've got a whole workshop full of underrated old workhorses to introduce you to the ugly one that won, the humble one that did all the work, the daft-looking idea that turned out to be secretly genius. The name's Reg. Mind the mud on your way out, and next time somebody tells you the war was won by the big frightening machines, you smile. And you tell them the far better story of the little one that just kept going.